Our speaker to start us off today is Rabbi Simon Jacobson, whom you may have heard over the Shabbaton. He wrote a book called Toward a Meaningful Life, The Teachings of the Rebbe, which, as I mentioned, is a tremendous book. I bought a copy. I'm leading a student tour in India. So on the bus, I'm reading a book, and I start to talk to one of the students, and I thought to myself, he needs this book more than I do, so I gave it. Then when I got back to America, I bought another copy, and I'm talking to another student. He needs this more than I do. Another one, she needs it more than I do. So I ended up buying about 7 copies of the book, and I haven't read it. But Kol HaKavod, it's an important book. Rabbi Jacobson is also the publisher of the Allgemeiner Journal, which you probably know, one of the leading Jewish newspapers in this country. And is, of course, his book on the Rebbe. His talk today is Ecosystems, the Inside Story, Dynamics of Matter, Energy, Fusion. Please welcome Rabbi Simon Jacobson.
Thank you, Professor Katz. Thank you. Good morning. Thank you much, Professor Katz, and Rabbi Lipsker, and Professor Bodenheimer, and all of the distinguished guests, all walks of life. As a short introduction to my presentation, I just want to put things into context. I grew up in the Torah world, and specifically in the Torah Hasidic world, which combines, you can say, the mystical and esoteric with the exoteric, what the Zohar would call the body and soul of Judaism. However, like all schools of intelligence, all schools of thought, everything has overlap, and that's what wisdom is about, a form of cross-pollination. So my presentation today is through the eyes of a person steeped and growing up in Torah and how I see science, which may be a very refreshing look because some people have the other way around. Through science, they see Torah, and some have perhaps an equal expertise in both. And I think all perspectives are legitimate. So it's good to hear, as I enjoyed every presentation, and also the informal conversations, which of course sometimes captures more than a formal one, the between the lines, the personalities. So I want to thank you all for that, and thank, of course, the organizers for making that happen. So that's my opening statement. So what I will present here is see here, the Ecosystems, the Inside Story, Torah Dynamics of Matter, Energy, Fusion. So one of the things that strikes me whenever I read anything, whether basic or more profound or more theoretical science, I say, wow, that reminds me of a certain Jewish law, halacha, or that reminds me of a Torah concept. Obviously, it may remind us of a mystical idea. And I also know that there are those that try to force it, and they try to turn science into just another mystical approach. Some dismiss it, and some embrace it. You know, in that world, Fridtjof Capra wrote the Tao of Physics. So some people swear by it, and some people curse it. You know, so I don't want to in any way presume that's the approach I'm taking here. So from my point of view, it's really a discussion, it's food for thought. So I tried to bring a combination of some interesting Torah ideas, as well as scientific ideas, and just point out some parallels. They may not be perfect parallels, and I'm sure we can debate it. And it's definitely not a definitive study and something exhaustive, but I think it's a good, it fits into the structure and the spirit of what we're doing here. And hence that name. So, the advent of recent scientific and technological developments have opened up unprecedented insights into the infinite. This is my writing, just for the record, yours truly. Symbiotic connection between nature and its relationship to human beings and the environment. Every fiber of existence is integrally linked through a complex yet eloquent flow of matter and energy. As with a holograph, every single neuron is the macrocosm, and the macrocosm is mirrored in the microcosm. This paper will explore the fascinating parallels between the Torah's legal and mystical perspective regarding our relationship with nature and the latest remarkable findings in science. After reviewing the commonalities, it will offer a new vision and propose ideological as well as practical suggestions of developing a new age unity between ourselves and the universe. It will explore how we can minimize the new risks and maximize the novel opportunities presented to us by modern science and technology as we forge ahead into a bold and exciting future. Now, why did I say I wrote this? Because if you ask me what's the source for this, I think I could find Torah sources, as I'll point out as we go along, that almost word for word I just translated into English. And I know there are scientific sources that would use the same opening paragraph here. And I want to especially thank Rabbi Lipsker, just to mention who actually was the one that, when we spoke about coming to this conference, he was the one that suggested this topic. So thank you. So the outline I'll go through, and in a brief way as possible, a symbiotic relationship between man and the universe. I try to break it down into some digestible structure, participatory universe, and fusion of matter and energy, and then some hypothetical conclusions. Okay, so we start symbiotic relationship between man and the universe, and I structured it Torah and science. Actual quotes, in most cases. So I'm not going to read everything in detail, but if anybody wants a copy of this, I'll be happy to make it available. So I started with a very classic statement that was known for thousands of years. Olam katan zeh adam. The universe, the human is a universe and microcosm. This is not a 21st century or 20th century concept. This goes back, and the root of the source is at the bottom of that page, Ovis de Rav Nosson, chapter, there we are, chapter, I like using that once in a while, so, chapter 31. And it's cited in different places. One of them is Shevet Musar, a classical middle-age scholar. And literally goes through, some say 32. You'll see some question marks. That's not my question mark. It's because the commentaries are not sure what certain words mean. So just to give a few examples. God created in man everything he created in his world. He created woods in the world, and in man, his hair. Wild animals, the bowels in man. I shortened it a bit, because there it's all in longhand. Soiled water, nasal discharge. I'm sorry, I skipped caves, ears. Scent or wind, nose. The sun, a man's glow. Soiled water, nasal discharge. I mean, you see, it's not all poetic exactly, but it's very explicit. And anyone studying a medrash like this says, you know what? This can be, you can write probably a book to try to see how these comparisons work. It's not what I'm doing here. I just wanted to point out that it's detailed. It's not just a general statement that the human being is a microcosm of the universe. Which, of course, the bottom line is the last line in the medrash says, you thus learned, meaning you, the student who just read this medrash, that everything the Almighty created in his world, he created in man. Now you can imagine the implications of that. Because besides these 32 items, what about all the other stuff? What about our neurons? What about our circulatory system, our heart? So some are mentioned explicitly, but this is not limiting it only to these 32. So you can take this into who knows how many levels of discussion. And when this was written or studied and so on, it wasn't necessarily seen as a scientific statement, but it's complete science, especially in today's world. Nobody says this is based on faith. You actually can find it, whether it's physical, actual physical, that the woods in the world is the hair in man, is it metaphorical? Fine, open for discussion, but there's no doubt that there is a relationship. I have some more quotes, obviously, on this. I just showed select ones, but it looks on the right side now. So I chose Anywhere is Everywhere. That's a poem from William Carlos. Now, I know some of you may say, why didn't I quote Everything is Everywhere from Bas Beckens and Bijernik, the microbiologist, Dutch microbiologist, because they also added, but the environment decides. So there you could argue that's not necessarily mean a microcosm-macrocosm relationship, because the environment is really the factor. But regardless, and then just a few quotes as well from Leibniz, the famous one, this interconnection or accommodation of all created things to each other, and each to all the others brings it about that each simple substance has relations that express all the others. and consequently, that each simple substance is a perpetual living mirror of the universe. Now, whether he saw the Avos the Rab Nosson or not, I don't know, but we know many of these thinkers were very exposed to Jewish thinkers, and artists were exposed, poets, and many of them went to consult because you get ideas from the creative artists. It's not always coming from a purely rational scientific approach. But just read the words, his own quote. Heisenberg, what we observe is not nature itself, but nature exposed to our method of questioning. Natural science does not simply describe and explain nature, it is part of the interplay of nature and ourselves. I don't think it's a stretch to say this is very, very parallel. Now again, as I opened up, I'm sure it could be argued, and some scientists will not like this comparison because they don't like comparing generally things from scientific thought and Torah thought. But I'm the one standing at the podium, and I do like those comparisons, so that's what I'm doing. Okay, next page. So this is a classic one, which almost today is already common, it's become pop culture, that Yud Kei Vav Kei, named the Tetragrammaton, the four-letter name of God, the holiest name, which we don't even pronounce, is all of existence is structured in four levels, Yud, Hey, Vav, Hey. And it's been pointed out that any transmission from a source to a recipient has to begin with a Yud, a point, it expands in a Hey, it then transmits in a Vav, which is like a line, and by the recipient, it's the Hey that receives it. And instead of bringing all the sources, there's a great work called a compendium, Sefer Al-Kutim Samach Tzedek. It's based on Havaya, the Erech, which is the entry called Havaya, and he brings many sources for this, going back to the earliest Kabbalistic sources, even the Sefer Yetzirah and others. So, it's been pointed out, the DNA of life on Earth naturally stores its information in just four key chemicals. I don't even know how to pronounce it, to be honest. Guanine, cystasin, adenine, and thymine. Did I pronounce it right? More or less. Okay. Commonly referred to as GCAT, respectively. And this I've heard from many people, not just Torah people, that it's fascinating, this parallel. Again, I'm not going into the detail, just to point out a very common parallel between two worlds, that once upon a time, those that knew Yud Kei Vav Kei did not necessarily know the DNA structure. They didn't even know there was DNA. But it's not, again, a stretch. Okay, next topic is a concept in mystical, especially Hasidic thought, called hiskalelus, interconnectivity. And briefly stated, all of existence is created in a symbiotic fashion. Every detail mirrors all the cosmos, and the cosmos are all reflected in every detail. And an analogy given for this in many places, one of them is, I just recently saw a beautiful letter from the Rebbe. Like the sun is reflected in a drop of water, like the sun is reflected equally in a drop of water like in a vast ocean. Same sun. You look at a drop of water, you look at a vast ocean. And then this is a famous prayer that is said by many in the Friday night service. Just as the Kagavna, it begins Kagavna, just as they, the six supernal days, the six Sfirot of Zar, Ampin, Natzilut, a mystical dimension, merge above in oneness and are nullified within the Or Ein Sof in absolute unity, so she, which is what is she, Malchus, Shabbat, of Atzilus, unites the 6 days below, in the lower worlds, in the mystery of oneness to be one, to be with them above. Thus the unity of the lower worlds parallels the unity of the higher worlds. I'll read it slowly. You'll see it's written in a somewhat mystical language, but it's a central theme. So I stick in a little poetry as well. William Blake, some call a mystical poet, some call him a scientific poet even. So of course one of his greatest poems, captured in such a beautiful way, to see a world in a grain of sand and a heaven in a wild flower, hold infinity in the palm of your hand and eternity in an hour. It states beautifully what everyone who studies Torah, when you hear about the power that you have in your hand in one act, which we'll soon quote some more sources for that. I also felt that this parallels somewhat the holographic universe, which again is almost like any idea in science, has its detractors and its embracers. Part of the universe contains information about the entire universe. First proposed by Gerald de Hooft It was given a precise string theory interpretation by Leonard Susskind, who combined his ideas with previous ones of 't Hooft and Charles Dornier. Now, I didn't quote because the quotes were a little dense, but you can look it up, obviously. And then fractal patterns by the famous mathematician Mandelbrot. He uncovered universal geometric patterns underlying physical reality. He discovered that fractal patterns are pervasive throughout the universe and reveal the innate harmonic order of the universe both on small and large scales. That's a quote from one of the classic books on the topic. And I'm just going to read on the right, because the left is the same, because I had more sources. So this goes into, I'm not going to read the whole thing, but basically fractals have been used to describe, I'm reading the second paragraph, random or chaotic phenomena such as crystal growth, fluid turbulence, and galaxy formation. And goes on, you find it in all levels of nature: clouds, coastlines, snowflakes, crystals, blood vessel networks, ocean waves, DNA, heart rhythms, various vegetables such as cauliflower and broccoli, mountain ranges, river networks, and fault lines. Fractal art is now commonplace. That's from Larry Dossey in One Mind. So you see, I mean, language that is almost replaceable from one Torah source to scientific sources. Okay. And finally, one more from David Bohm, the implicit order. So he came up with this idea, which, again, assure you that many people don't agree with it. In the unfolded or implicit order, which means, right, space and time are no longer the dominant factors determining the relationship of dependence or independence of different elements. Rather, an entirely different sort of basic connection of elements is possible, from which our ordinary notions of space and time, along with those of separately existent material particles, are abstracted as forms derived from the deeper order. These ordinary notions, in fact, appear in what is called the explicit or unfolded order, which is a special and distinguished form contained within the general totality of all the implicit orders. And he's quoted quite extensively. So let us move to the next page. So here on the left, Sfirot as composites. So for those of you not familiar with the 10 Sfirot structure, which is actually based on verses in the Torah, Lacha, Hashem, Agdula. So it says every individual Sfira, which let's just translate as building block of existence, divine energy building block of existence, is a composite of all the others, of all the other Sfirot. They're all entangled and interconnected in an intricate way, creating one mosaic out of a multitude of details. And this is something we, again, many prayer books on Friday evening, we say it, Pasach Elio in the introduction to Tikkunei Zohar. So, of course, the first thing that jumps out of you is entanglement. The word entanglement is a very interesting word, and that's the word used in Hebrew. So quantum entanglement. So I just gave a summary here a little about it, again, not with any profound depth. In quantum physics, entangled particles remain connected so that actions performed on one affect the other, even when separated by great distances. A phenomenon so strange that Albert Einstein famously described it as spooky action at a distance. This year, July, an incredible first physicist at the University of Glasgow captured the world's first actual photo of quantum entanglement. Now, obviously, it has to be replicated, and a few years ago, physicists Carlos Sabin and Borja Prepapard, Spanish. I'll skip the names, okay? I can read the Institute of Fundamental Physics at the Spanish National Research Council in Madrid. They published a paper on a new kind of entanglement in a recent issue of Physical Review Letters. They write, we show that it is possible in the real experiment to entangle two systems that neither interact with each other nor interact with a common resource at the same time and without the need of measurements. The trick is to use the correlations between different times, between past and future, contained in the vacuum of a quantum field. So I know this goes into time travel and a lot of other things that people call fantasy, but conceptually, it definitely fits into the framework of our discussion here. And then yet another holonomic brain theory. And I just want to add again for those that I am stretching it, I'm pushing it, because I want us all to think, we have to think imaginatively and creatively. So quantum mind, a new concept. Memories may be enfolded within every region of the brain rather than being localized in particular regions of the brain, cells or atoms. This is close to me especially because in the study of memory, which is something I did for many years, how does memory work? And this is, of course, Carl Pribram, famous Karl Pribram, and who mirrored the ideas of Bohm. The holographic nature is also reflected in the mind. And there have been books, Quantum Mind, Quantum Brain. Not all agree, but some say you can explain the mind in a quantum-like way, which just adds to the whole equation of this parallels and interconnectivity. Fine. We move on. This is a little digressing, but I just found it intriguing. I thought I'll just dump it in here. I don't know if that's the right word, to include it in here. Yeah. And to fold it in here, right. And this is Chesed Gvura. Again, a concept very familiar to many of you, essentially right and left, which is kindness and discipline. They balance each other. Chesed on the right side is love. It flows like water and connects everything. Gvura on the left side is discernment and constriction. It separates and defines the parameters of everything. So again, it's Pasach Eliyahu, and explained in many different places as the sources indicate. So this brought me to, just skipping, to Jill Bolte Taylor's famous TED Talk, which also was then turned into a book. The book is called, I'm just going to the next page, My Stroke of Insight, A Brain Scientist's Personal Journey. I'm not going to read the whole thing here, but basically what I found when I heard her speak, it immediately jumped out at me, this Kabbalistic concept. She basically became a neuroscientist, I believe, because her brother had schizophrenia. That's what she says. So she wanted to study the mind. And then God, in his mysterious ways, decides to strike her with a stroke on the left side of her brain. So suddenly her right brain is functioning, her left is not. As a neuroscientist, she immediately began to explore what is going on. And this is her language. Our right hemisphere functions like a parallel processor, while our left hemisphere functions like a serial processor. They care about different things, and dare I say, they have very different personalities. Our right brain perceives the big picture and recognizes that everything around us, about us, among us, and within us is made up of energy particles that are woven together into a universal tapestry. I'm skipping right away to the left brain because I want to make sure I use my time right. Our left hemisphere is a very different place. It thinks linearly and methodically. It is designed to take that enormous collage and start picking out details, and more details about those details. It then categorizes and organizes all that information associated with everything in the past we've ever learned and projects into the future all our possibilities. And then goes on to explain, but perhaps, I'm skipping a paragraph, but perhaps most important is that little voice, the left side of the brain, that says to me, I am. And as soon as my left hemisphere says to me, I am, I become separate. I become a single solid individual separate from the energy flow around me and separate from you. And this was the portion of my brain that I lost the morning of my stroke. And then finally, based upon my experience with losing my left mind, I wholeheartedly believe that the feeling of deep inner peace is neurological circuitry is located in our right brain. I mean, when I read this or heard it, I said to myself, it's exactly Chesed Gvur. That's what we need both of them for. We live in a world of details. But at the same time, there has to be the big picture. And how many implications of that message? Now, I know I've read neuroscientists who disagree with her take. They say she's emotional and she had the stroke and so on. But that's another discussion, not for here. You know, there's always opinions. Okay. The next thing in this context, Chachma encompasses all. This is a fundamental concept in, again, mystical Hasidic thought. The mind, and specifically the first spark of an idea called Chachma, contains within it all of existence in concentrated form, like the brain, which drives the central nervous system of the entire body. And the sources, this compendium, this encyclopedia gives many sources for this. So, on the right side, science, the first results from our comparison. I'm reading from The Strange Similarity of Neuron and Galaxy Networks by astrophysicist Franco Vaza and neuroscientist Alberto Filetti. They wrote, the first results from our comparison between the complexity of galaxy networks and neuronal networks are truly surprising. Not only are the complexities of the brain and cosmic web actually similar, but so are their structures. The total number of neurons in the human brain falls in the same ballpark of the number of galaxies in the observable universe. And they actually posted an image with a left being I don't even know which is the left, between the image of the cosmic. Figure 1, we show a simulated distribution of cosmic matter in a slice 1 billion light years across, along on the right side with a real image of a 4 micrometers thick slice through the human cerebellum. Cerebellum, right. And the bottom, I quote where exactly the details of how this was done. Obviously, it's simulated, but it's based on real images. Yeah. Okay, so we covered the symbiotic relationship. Now we'll talk about participatory universe. That there's not just a relationship that one is reflected in the other, but they actually affect one another. And of course, in Torah language, it will always be with moral responsibility, not just a scientific observer's impact on the universe. So these are classic quotes. Almost everybody knows them. But when you hear it in this context, it takes on a whole different dimension. Save a soul, save a universe. I believe this may have been quoted by others that have presented. Therefore, the Mishnah in Sanhedrin 37a, Adam was created alone to teach you that anyone who destroys one's soul, the verse ascribes him blame as if he destroyed an entire world, as Adam was one person from which the population of an entire world came forth. And conversely, someone who sustains a soul or saves a soul, the verse ascribes him credit as if he sustained an entire world. Then there's the classic quote from Maimonides, a person must see himself, I think Rabbi Shem Tov mentioned it yesterday in his talk, must see himself and the world as equally balanced on two ends of the scale. By doing one good deed, he tips the scale and brings for himself and the entire world redemption and salvation. So this is clear participatory. Not just participatory, it's obligated responsibility. Professor Steinberg yesterday spoke about not just we're allowed to heal, we have perhaps a responsibility to do so. And I quote here, and this is just Hashgacha Pratis, I know Professor Bodenheimer quoted this, about when you besiege a city, you shall not destroy its trees, and you shall not cut them down, for the human is a tree of the field for alternative, the tree of the field is like a human. So yes, the conventional interpretation, all the commentaries, Rashi, the Ramban, the Even Ezra, do not interpret the verse as a statement. It's saying a man is not like a tree. So why are you cutting down the tree? But I have to tell you that the Bechar Shar and some other commentaries, which I believe is the basis why we hear often, you'll hear in speeches or you hear in different commentaries, the parallels. Just as a tree has roots, a human has roots. Just as a tree bears fruits, a human bears fruits. So I did a little research. I said, is this like based on a false interpretation of the verse? So there are sources that actually, and they have to force the verse because the verse, no question, is not comparing the two. I just brought it to create a little controversy. I didn't realize you're going to bring it up, so this was just there, that there is a basis to say a very interesting statement. You shall not cut down a tree because you are a tree, and a tree is you. In a way you can broaden it, you should not destroy the environment or in any way defile it because you are part of the environment and the environment is part of you. We're not separate entities. So that's a whole different level of responsibility because it's not just, okay, you have to be, the environment is sacred because God created it. You are a piece of it. You destroy it, you're destroying yourself. Similar, not exactly when we speak about Ahavas Yisrael and the famous Yerushalmi that says, you hurt another person, you're hurting yourself. Right arm, left arm. We're part of one organism. So it takes on a whole different shape. Whether it's actually the interpretation in the verse, it's fine. It doesn't change the discussion here because there are plenty of other sources for this idea. So then, of course, John Wheeler's participatory anthropic principle, which Dr. Poltorak, Professor Poltorak, I don't know all the titles, mentioned at one of the lunches. We talked about it. Nothing is more important, writes Wheeler, about the quantum principle than this, that it destroys the concept of the world as sitting out there, with the observer safely separated from it by a 20-centimeter slab of plate glass, even to observe so minuscule as an object as an electron, he must shatter the glass, he must reach in, he must install his chosen measuring equipment. It is up to him to decide whether he shall measure position or momentum. To install the equipment to measure, the one prevents and excludes his installing the equipment to measure the other. Bottom line, to describe what has happened, one has to cross out that old world observer and put in its place the new world participator. In some strange sense, the universe is a participatory universe. There are, for the record, people do not agree with that, but this is pretty much accepted today as one of the best theories. Okay. There's a little more from the Torah, just a few verses. God created and man perfects. That's the Medrash Rabbah that Professor Steinberg mentioned yesterday. Shabara Likim Lases L'Sakin. Participatory. The human is a partner with God in creation. Shutaf LaKadosh Baruch Hu b'matim ma'aseh bereshis. That's a famous Talmud in Shabbos when you say Vayechulu. The word partnership with God. That's pretty strong. And finally, talking about observer defining reality. So we had the whole discussion. There are many different examples for it. So this actually comes from something I heard from the Lubavitcher Rebbe in 1980. Actually, it was 1979. It was Shabbos Chanukah. And since it's this week's chapter, I decided let me include that as an example. So this is a Gemara in Brachos. On the verse that when Joseph shared his dreams about how he would dominate over his brothers, so, of course, those dreams incited his brothers, the jealousy, and that was the beginning of a lot of problems. What did Yaakov do? So it says, Yaakov shomer es hadavar. There's an expression, a vague, cryptic sentence. Yaakov shomer es hadavar. He protected the thing, literally stated. So many interpretations in that. Rashi, the Gemara says like this. There were 24 dream interpreters in Jerusalem. One time I had a dream and went to each of them. What one interpreted for me, the other did not interpret for me. And yet, they were all realized in me. To fulfill that which is stated, all dreams follow the interpretation. Kol hachalomot holchim achar hapitaron. Brachos 55b. And the Rebbe brought it in that Shabbos, Miketz, Tavshin Mem, 1979, and compared it to what I'm going to show you in a moment, quotes from some mystical sources. Now, is this not an observer affecting reality? So that's why the Pasuk says, Yaakov felt, I'm not going to say anything, because if I interpret the dream, it's going to follow the interpretation. Let me leave it vague and amorphous, and that way it never will become, it'll never be measured. It'll never be observed. That's the Talmud. Now, I know there's other examples. There's Eidei Kiyum, witnesses that actually create a reality and don't just observe one. Let's say the witnesses at a chuppah, a wedding. They are not just telling us, okay, marriage happened. They actually are part of the process and they create. There's other examples, but here's another fascinating one. So in the next section, which is the third and final section, fusion of matter and energy. So I will indicate in a moment where this dream interpreter relates. So we'll start on the left side. Matter is energy. Every fiber of existence is a soul that vivifies it. All matter is really divine energy packaged in a physical shell. This is classic Kabbalistic thought, going all the way back to the Zohar, but even Arizal, of course, documented it in Eitz Chaim, as the sources indicate. The whole second section of Tanya, Shar Yichud V'Amunah of the Alter Rebbe, who's on Tuesday will be celebrating his Geula, is based on that. Divine energy. I'll have here the quote in a moment. And finally, Sinai itself, the halachic. And this is not even mystical. This is pure halacha. What happened at Sinai? How can you quantify the contribution of Sinai, Mount Sinai? The patriarchs, Kaimu Kol HaTorah, they kept all the Torah and mitzvahs. Tayag mitzvah shamarti, we heard yesterday, that Jacob said to Lavan. So, if they kept all the mitzvahs, what happened at Sinai that was so unique? And we say it was a one-time phenomenon. So what happened is, as the verse says, Vayered Hashem al Har Sinai. God descended on Mount Sinai. However you explain that in non-anthropomorphic terms. And Moses went up. So there's a classic medrash that says, and I'm reading straight from a medrash Tanchuma. Before Sinai, there was a rift between heaven and earth, between matter and spirit. At a decree, a schism separated like the transcendental and the material. That which was above could not descend below, and that which was below could not ascend above. At Sinai, the decree was rescinded, and now the lower can ascend to the higher, and the higher can descend to the lower. Essentially, matter can be transformed into energy. In the language of halacha, especially Rab Chaim Brisker, a chefze shel chayil could become a chefze shel gedusha. So it's not just a gavra thing, I'll explain. It's not just the person does a mitzvah. They actually transform the object. You take a piece of hide from an animal, and you do it the right way according to Torah law. And you write the words of a Sefer Torah, sanctified in all the conditions. A mere hide of an animal in the wild becomes something that was Kedusha permanently. And even if that Torah scroll becomes puzzle, meaning you can't use it anymore, you don't just discard it. You bury it. It's a whole process. because holiness never leaves. You've transformed a physical object. And this is true with every mitzvah that after Sinai. Before Sinai, that was not possible. Abraham did many mitzvahs. Besides the bris, which was commanded by God, did not transform the physical. This does not take away from what he accomplished. So essentially, why wouldn't it make total sense that a Jew, several thousand years later, would come up with maybe the most famous formula of all, E equals mc squared. One that everybody says, but most people don't even know what it means. Ask most people what C is. The E in M is energy and matter. What's C? I'm not this room. I know everybody knows that here. So E equals mc squared is a physics formula for a conceptual concept that, not just conceptual, that was really what Jews lived with all our lives. I don't think Einstein knew the Medrash Tanchuma. Maybe he did. I don't know. I don't know if he knew about the contribution of Sinai, but we do. And sometimes things work in the subconscious. Who knows? So here you have it, matter and energy, a concept that was always known by Jews, even simple Jews knew they did a mitzvah, they changed the world. How? They didn't understand always the science of it. So let's move on here. Divine worlds energize existence. The verses from the words of God, the heaven was formed, forever our God, O God, your word stands firm in the heavens. And of course, the ethics of the fathers, the world was created with 10 utterances. Words vivify existence, language, divine language. And on the right side, I just wrote a few, this was quick notes, to be honest, not really worked out, didn't have the time, sorry about that. But the atom, concentrated energy, building blocks of matter, the parallels are undeniable. Vibrating strings of energy, string theory, mathematical abstraction. Basically taking the physical world away from what we always thought, this is the physical world, and maybe there's something beneath the surface a little. Here's the other way around. Everything is beneath the surface, and what we see on the surface is just the outer tip of the iceberg, which ultimately leads to singularity, which again, we'll talk about in a moment, Hashem Echad. Okay. I'm going to be a little quicker now because of time limits, so this is the text that I mentioned, Shai Yuchad V'Amunah, and you can look it up. It's very powerful, especially in scientific context. Basically, the Baal Shem Tov explained that your word, God's word, is not just a word. When we speak, it can affect people, but it doesn't create. He says, when your word, which you uttered, let there be a firmament in the midst of the waters, these very words and letters stand firmly forever within the firmament of heaven, and are forever clothed within all the heavens to give them life. And goes on to explain this in detail. And obviously quotes the Arizal that says even inanimate objects, like a stone, are full of energy. Something that once upon a time would have been dismissed as fantasy. Today no one will dismiss that. There's no such thing as an inanimate entity. It's inanimate to the eye, but it's filled with, brimming with pulsating energy. Okay. Now another interesting Kabbalistic statement from the Arizal, from the thickness, the particles and energy, the containers are formed. So this makes the symbiosis even deeper. It's not just energy creating matter and energizing matter. Actually, there is matter within energy in a sense. And that needs explanations. An abstract form is particles within light. I didn't want to go into the details. The concept of wave and particle is a classic disagreement between Kabbalists. Is light a wave or a particle? Does it have shape or does it have no shape? But we'll not go into that right now. And John Wheeler, it from bit. It from bit, what is that? The it comes from the bit. It's not another way of saying that the material world comes from language. It from bit symbolizes the idea that every item of the physical world has at bottom, at a very deep bottom in most instances, an immaterial source and explanation. That which we call reality arises in the last analysis from the posing of yes-no questions and the registering of equipment-evoked responses. In short, that all things physical are information theoretic in origin, and this is a participatory universe. Okay, this is some more quotes, and here's the quote I want to just refer to of that I mentioned before with the dreams. How energy, there's a whole discussion in Kabbalistic and Chassidic thought, how does energy evolve into matter then? Where would it suddenly move over? If it's energy, divine energy, words, how does it become matter? So it's a fascinating process, literally called an evolution, not in time, but conceptually, where you have energy slowly diminishing and the containers emerging. And the best example you have is for the development of a fetus. Upon the moment of conception, you have one cell. If you were able to see that cell, it's minuscule. What's in that cell? What happened at the moment of conception? What happened? Something began to materialize. It's a very negligible something, but it has everything. All the complexity of your life is all included in that. All the therapy you go to, and all the issues, and all the anxieties, and all the joys, all in that little concentrated. And then it splits, and then splits again, and many times over. This is a perfect example of what happens in the macrocosm, what's called Seder Ishtalshelus, the cosmic order, that God did it that way. He didn't have to do it that way, but he wanted it to be logical, that it begins in a concentrated form. It begins with a particle that's not even visible, and slowly, as the energy becomes diminished, the containers emerge, and you have these three stages, akudim, nekudim, vrudim, which is 10 energies in one container. Then you have 10 energies in 10 containers, and then finally the containers emerge, and what do you have? A newborn child. Everything is in harmony. That's what we call tikkun. That's where tikkun comes from, a harmonized world, instead of being chaotic or being imbalanced or dysfunctional. This requires obviously a lot more, and because of time, I'm just summing it up. So, in that sense, the energy begins on a conceptual level and then it takes form, is very similar like the dream-like state, that when someone observes or someone interprets, that takes form. So on the right side, I just gave a little evolution of the quantum states of probability, according to certain interpretations, the more popular ones. I'm not going to read it all, but it basically, through Planck, mentioned yesterday about photons, Schrodinger, and Pauli. All essentially describing, and I believe if you study the Kabbalistic or Hasidic model and theirs, you'll find tremendous parallels that I'm sure each can contribute to the other in understanding what their meaning is. So, and the purpose of it all is to bring to singularity, on the left side, to bring all these details into an echad, into a unity. The pre-Tzimtzum energy light is utterly shapeless, seamless, and undefined, containing all potential possibilities. Within that undetermined quantum-like state, I added the words quantum-like, the divine will chose to have a deterministic image emerge, the 10 hidden sfirot, which will serve as the root of the cosmic order and structure of the entire universe. And when we align all the details in the macroscopic world, in the macrocosm, aligned to what the purpose of existence is, we reveal the singularity where it all began. So the end and the beginning are wedged in each other, the classic expression. Again, on the right side, I just bring more from Heisenberg. The atoms or elementary particles themselves are not real. They form a world of potentialities or possibilities rather than one of things or facts. And Bohr, isolated material particles are abstractions, their properties being definable and observable only through their interactions with other systems. And finally, at the end, quantum computers. So this is now opening up a whole new field. Quantum computing, Google and others are working on it. And essentially, instead of zeros or ones, listen to this language. In quantum physics, unlike in classical computer science, 0 and 1 are not an either or. Both simultaneously or anything in between is also possible. It could be a 0 and a 1 at the same time, which of course opens up the speed and so on and so forth. And there was at least recent, in August, there was a team of physicists that demonstrated it in practice. Okay, so here we are, conclusions. I'm sure there are many more. These are the ones that come to mind. So here we are. Man is one with the universe. 2, B. We affect and are affected by everything around us. An intrinsic majestic unity connects us all. Man has the power to reveal that unity. E. Torah and science can learn from each other in both developing technologies and harnessing them for experiencing transcendence and fulfilling our divine calling. To transform this world into a home for God, which is, of course, an expression from the Medrash. And finally, F, the unified field theory will be achieved when man's harmony is synchronized with the universe's harmony. This I just had to throw in a little monkey wrench for some people who want to argue, that maybe the unified field theory is the ultimate expression. You cannot achieve it if you're not a moral human being. And your own inner microcosm is not harmonious. How do you expect to find harmony in the world around you that's watching you and being impacted by you? From food for thought. And hopefully with this work that we're doing here, all of us together, will ultimately create the utter fusion, because what happened at Matan Torah Sinai, E equals mc squared, energy equals matter, will be completely realized, not just in the inner worlds, but in the outer world, that this world will be aligned, the total singularity, and all the details will matter, harmony within diversity, coming of Mashiach. Thank you very much.